Just as Silas was a big character for the lore in 2019, Riot mentioned that Ixtal might have a similarly big role in 2020. And so, last week, not only did they update the lore and art of Ixtal on Universe, but they also dropped a massive story pushing the region forward. And that's what we will have a look at today. The story is simply called the Axiomata, which for those of you who are not native English speakers, and even for some of you who are, axiom is an ancient Greek word for established rules or even scientific laws. And when it comes to Ixtal, the Ixtali people refer to the laws under which the elements behave as the Axiomata. So to the Ixtali people, the elements can simply be manipulated with magical science. For example, the Ixtali quarrymen use the 16th axiom, the fishermen manipulate currents of water with the 3rd axiom, and the messengers use the wind for speed with the 5th axiom. It's all just a set of rules. But the story will dig deeper into that. So without further ado, let's have a look at the story, the Axiomata. Because the story is quite long, I'll try to shorten it as much as possible without taking away any of the details. But at the same time, I should warn you that this story will be easier to understand if you watch our video on Kiana and Ixtal first. But I'll try to explain everything anyway, so it shouldn't be required. At the beginning, the story introduces our main character, an adult Ixtali called Aliye. His mother was a hunter, and she was the one providing meat for their village called Semshul. His father was a gardener. He attended vines that grew around Ixtal and kept its people safe. Both of Aliye's parents hoped that he would become a hunter or a gardener, but he chose neither. He combined their lessons into his own path. He had studied the Axiomata, which are the fundamental rules under which the elements work, for 23 years. This gave him understanding and control over the elements. Even so, all Ixtali were equally linked with the elements, but those who wished to master them needed a focus, an item that would help guide the elements and make them do what the wielder wished. Aliye stepped into a river and wrapped braids of rope around his hands. It was a wind cord. He raised his hands and traced the lines of the 5th axiom from memory, while whipping the cord around like a paintbrush. The wind followed his moves and a bubble of air formed in the middle of the river, blocking the water from flowing through and revealing the river's muddy floor. The story revealed that besides all the mud, rocks and wood, sometimes there were also foreign objects in the water. Aliye called these items ancient reminders of the lost world, and he hinted that these must have come from an ancient civilization that mastered crafting. Since none of these ancient artifacts seemed to be touched by time, they were always in perfect condition. And the same applied to the artifact he noticed just moments ago. He sat down in the mud, right in the middle of his air bubble, and dug up a short-handled axe, crafted from a single piece of steel. After taking in its beauty, he searched around the mud until he found his waterproof treasure box. It had a special lock only he or those who mastered the Axiomata could open. It was filled with everything Aliye felt was worth saving or hiding, and he placed the axe there, right beside a bronze helmet. His plan was to bring this treasure box to Ixtal and give it to the historians, once he would become Yuntao, which is a special word for the elemental masters that govern Ixtal from the Yuntal castle. It is the highest achievable status besides being the ruler of Ixtal. His mentor, Mivazim, wasn't too happy that Aliye was really interested in the world beyond, which the Ixtali called the Naziana, and so Aliye kept the box hidden for the time being. But then Aliye noticed that the air cord was gone, and he panicked. He scrambled in the mud, but it simply vanished. But then he noticed that the river remained parted, even without his air cord. And although this was something only the Yuntal would be capable of, he was still in control. For a split of a second, a manic thought entered his head. He imagined himself wrapped in the elements, walking in a landscape that was empty of life but full of answers. But then he was knocked back into reality as water flew up into the air and dropped back down, slowly filling his bubble of air. Aliye noticed that it was the work of a nearby older woman, his mentor, Mivazim. She stood at the riverbank, covered in dark Yuntal robes. At Mivazim's command, the water in the river sped up, and Aliye's bubble shrank down. Aliye wondered if this meant that Mivazim knew about his little secret all along. But despite the fact that he would soon be swept away by the river, his mentor showed no hint of anger. Instead, she waved her hand and drew axiomatic lines between them. This was another test Aliye trained for years to solve. He imagined himself walking towards his mentor in the modest halls of Semshul. When he reached her side, his spirit was lifted by her triumphant smile, but his body was ripped into pieces. Mivazim opened her arms in time to catch his collapsing form, but then she told him that it was time. In Aizaokan, Allier would defend himself beneath the Vidalion, and they would judge whether he was worthy of becoming Yuntal. The story then cuts to Allier and Mivazim, who were just about to leave a small village called Peslan. They were on their way to Aizaokan, but even after weeks of marching, they still had a long way to go. So every now and then they stopped in a village for a short rest. While they were in Peslan, Allier noticed how afraid the people were of Ixtal's borders. Nobody really knew what was outside their region, and nobody dared to explore it. It was the fear of the unknown. But still, Allier's father was a gardener who tended to the very vines that kept Ixtal's border safe. And yet, he wasn't afraid. As Allier and Mivazim talked, they mentioned the gardener's work, and Allier revealed what was his father's view on his duty. According to his father, in the years following the final war, there was much chaos. The world boiled and churned with monsters and death. They were pushed almost to extinction, when the wisest of them, the first of the Yun, turned the Axiomata of Aizaokan into a weapon, quelling every foe and sealing their borders. And so this was the only land to have survived those cataclysmic days. The world outside was left poisoned. Beneath Ixtal's canopies, they were protected from the doom that consumed all else. And so, truly, it was the great gardeners of Semshul who now kept Ixtal from the same dark fate. Of course, if you are not sure what this story is referring to, it seems like the Ixtali believed that the world was permanently tainted and poisoned by the Void, after it consumed Icathia. Or at least I assume Ixtal isolated itself after the fall of Icathia, because before that, they were still in contact with the outside world. A good example being Zillion, who traveled here, or even Nazuk, the Ixtali ascended god warrior, who was in contact with Shurima. But either way, the reason for Ixtal's closure seems to be the Void. That's why they make sure the vines around their borders are isolating them from the rest of the world. Mivazim smiled and she sprinkled a bit of doubt into that legend. She asked Allier if the machines that cut into their jungles are an extension of that poison. The machines, of course, are the mining tanks from Piltover, that occasionally come to Ixtal for minerals or wood. Allier simply said that perhaps they are, but the Yuntal were still well equipped to fight them. Since it was a master and a scholar talking, the two asked some philosophical questions about the problems with these machines, and both agreed that should they want to have a subjective opinion on them, they better ask a villager or a trader, who doesn't have the pride nor experience of someone tending the borders. Only then their view wouldn't be swayed by emotion. Then the story cuts to the moment Allier and Mivazim walk the stone road to the northern gate of Aizaokan, the capital city of Ixtal. Unlike the border village of Semshul, where Allier was from, this place was packed full of all kinds of people, from young students and beauticians to scryers and craftsmen. And still, as Mivazim walked through, it became obvious that no matter where in Ixtal you were, they all held absolute respect for the Yuntal. Soon after their arrival, an old man, also dressed in black Yuntal robes, waved at Mivazim. His name was Chik, which was short for Chikweslan. Just like Mivazim, he had also come here with his students. In fact, he had a dozen of them, and he was surprised to see that Mivazim only had Allier with her. In response, she explained that she likes to tend the villages, where the students have less time for studying, and where they soon leave for more achievable pursuits. There was a hint of rivalry between them, but the Vidalian would tell which was the better teacher. Just as they finished their conversation, one of Chik's students tripped on their robes, and they flicked their elemental focus. A small flame cast out and set a merchant's duster on fire. The merchant tried to save his stand by channeling water to put it out, but the flames kept going. It was only when Mivazim drew out the air from the flames that it was finally put out. Although Mivazim apologized to the merchant, Chik went on a rant about how strong the flames of his student were, and how quickly they consumed. Allier got annoyed at his behavior, but before he was able to say something, Mivazim reminded him that Chik was also a Yuntal. And she told him that so far, he has only met a couple of them, and soon he would learn a cruel lesson. One that would show him that not all Yuntal nor Aizaokan are as great as they may seem. Then the story cuts to the test of the Vidalion. Inside Axiomata, there is a grand chamber, which the Ixtali believe to be positioned right in the center of Runeterra. Above this chamber stands the Vidalion, which is an ancient artifact that can weave magic into material form. And once a person is accepted into the ruling Ixtal castle, the Vidalion weaves their magic into their own Ixtal robes. This is the proof that they have become a true elemental master. As the tests went through, despite him dedicating his life to studying the Axiomata, Chikweslaan's fire-weaving student failed, and so he had to leave Axiomata in silence. Perhaps he would become a merchant or a storyteller, but he would never be a Ixtal. As days of testing passed, more of Chik's students failed, which crushed the morale of the rest of their group, while reinforcing Alie's resolve. And in time, finally, Alie's turn had come. As he stepped into the heart of Axiomata, he noticed the floor was etched with thousands of curving lines that represented different axioms, and above him, he saw the Ixtal watching him from the gallery. The chamber where he stood now was split into two halves. The lower half where he was to defend himself, and the upper half where a wide ring of heavy stone was suspended in the air. And high above that, there was the Vidalion. As Alie stepped right into the center of the elemental patterns, he was blinded by the surge of power. It was the elemental might focused by the Axiomata into a single spot. It was overwhelming, but after Alie blinked just once, the chamber returned back to normal. After that, the name Alie Kwun Lan echoed through the chamber as it was announced by one of the Ixtal above, which marked the beginning of the test. The Vidalion started spinning, and Alie reached out to let the woven tendrils of magic fall into his hands. Although the goal of this test was never explained, it seems like the point of the test was to see if Alie would be able to use the Vidalion's magical threads to draw out an Axiomata pattern for his own Ixtal robes. These robes would later serve as his elemental focus. Depending on how he would let the Vidalion weave the threads, the final robes would affect different Axiomata, and it would interact with different elemental laws. As he set to work on the elemental threads, some of the Ixtal above commented on his design. The first disapproving voice mentioned that he had cut off a second from the pattern, and now it would affect temperature but not pressure. Alie ignored the comment at first, but later he replied that pressure and temperature were sisters. While he controls the space, this effect would be more powerful. Another Ixtal mentioned that there were 11 tangents in his Axiomata, and since not every tangent had a parallel, he risked imbalance when the patterns were joined. But again, Alie dismissed the comment by saying that practice is not mastery. And in his design, the patterns empowered the first and the fifth axiom, which negates the imbalance. After that, Alie continued his work in silence. But then he noticed one of the Yunalai smirking at him. The Yunalai is a respectable name for the royal daughters of the ruler of Ixtal, so seeing the smirk made him feel a bit uneasy. As Alie kept going, he surprised himself by how well he was able to weave the power of the Vidalion. But suddenly, it all stopped seemingly for no reason. It was like a stutter in time. He felt something call to him. Instinctively, he reached out for it, and the world suddenly became a dream. He looked down and he saw the Axiomata as a single pattern that covered the whole world. He rode along one of the lines circling Axiomata until he ended up back home in Samshul. When he arrived there, he fell backwards, right into the vines that separated Ixtal from the void-corrupted lifeless world outside. He braced for oblivion and pushed through. But instead of annihilation, there was lush greenery and open field full of animals. For a second, Alie thought he went mad, and he wondered if these were his final thoughts. Perhaps he had failed the test. As his soul traveled across the world, he saw mountains, but surprisingly, he saw other people. He stopped somewhere cold, where people were covered in fur. He saw power beneath the snow. The Axiomata crossed there. Alie reached out for the people he saw, which formed swirling clouds of power. The people fled from this phenomenon, but the tallest of them, who held a spear of frost, looked up and stared into Alie's eyes. He could feel the barbarian searching for him in the sky. He was not Ixtali, so Alie wondered how was the brute able to tap into the Axiomata. The local magic was different, and it came from somewhere else. In fact, Alie realized the magic wasn't touching him. Suddenly, the very idea of the barbarian's existence overwhelmed Alie. It was wrong. There is nothing beyond Ixtal. But then, as quickly as this dream started, it all vanished, and Alie was kicked back into reality. It all made sense now. Of course the world wasn't dead. Of course Ixtal didn't hold back the apocalypse with a thin layer of vines. Allier thought about his father, how proud he was of his work, all while being ignorant of his true purpose. As this new revelation sinked in, at first Allier accepted the truth, and his heartbeat slowed down. But then, the feeling of betrayal, embarrassment and grief hit him, and he felt the urge to use the power of the Vidalion to crush this chamber and trap them all in. The only reason why he didn't do it was because he was trained in the ways of philosophy, and he questioned what was the truth behind his emotions right now. That's when he realized this was the test. The world couldn't be explained or even described. To understand it, one would have to see it for themselves. And the purpose of having so many Yuntal watching over the test was to stop those who would lose against their own emotions, and who would try to use the Vidalion against Ixtal itself. Allier refused to be crushed by this reality, and as his rage cooled down to determination, he returned to his work on the pattern, and the Yuntal remained silent. The story then cuts to the moment Allier finished his work. That's when the story finally revealed what was he working on this whole time. He was making his own Axiomata mark. He designed it to empower air and water, and all the ways the two could be combined. The Yuntal found no errors in his work. The test was over. And so the Vidalion spun faster, sucking magic from Allier's blood, and covering him in a web of magical cloth. The power of the Vidalion lifted him above the ground, as the Yuntal chanted words he couldn't understand. He was now one of them. In the next scene, Allier woke up from his rest after the ceremony. Mivazim was with him. She was proud of her student, which has now become her peer. The two talked about what happened during the test, which gave Allier a chance to summarize all he had learned there. He was now part of a greater lie. Only the Yuntal knew the truth, that the world outside was very much alive. But they can't just let anyone know. The best way to do it would be to let people see it through the Vidalion. But even to the Yuntal, it was hard to process it all. And without the required wisdom, one could easily go mad. And with the Vidalion, they could end the entire nation. This all started when the ancient Yun were faced with a dilemma. When they had to figure out how to best protect their people from the void, they chose to close themselves in, and only the Yuntal would know what's happening outside their region. Which means that for countless centuries, since the threat was gone, the Yuntal argued among themselves about their work, but no one ever brought up the suggestion that maybe they should reverse the old decision and reveal themselves to the world. In the next scene, Allier was feasting with the other Yuntal. He noticed that some of the other newly accepted Yuntal were as angry as he was, but their frustration was soothed by their comrades, since this was nothing new to them. They were all angry when they joined. That's when Allier heard Kiana's laugh, after she mentioned that she had seen better celebrations for the birth of a mule. The two introduced each other. Of course, Kiana talked about herself in third person, and after a while, the two started talking about what they saw during their tests. Kiana mentioned that she saw some primal being clawing at the skies, and she felt power similar to Aizaokan's, but it was somewhere far away, and many people tried to control it. Allier agreed that he saw something similar, and the two bonded over the idea that having such power in the world, without a Yuntal to govern it, would be horrible. But together, they could change that. The last part of the story cuts to a year after the celebration. For the first time since his test, Allier returned to the Grand Chamber, together with the other Yuntal. He sat in the gallery with Mivazim and Kiana, and they were about to watch another student do the test. Throughout these past months, Allier was forming a perfect argument that would convince the other Yuntal to open Ixtal to the rest of the world. And soon, the time would come. That's the entire Axiomata story. Hopefully it makes some sort of sense to you, because it is not the easiest story to understand. Especially since we are talking about the Axiomata, which are scientific elemental laws that decide how elements behave. But you also need to realize that you can use your magic to draw Axiomata patterns using magical threads that affect how the elements behave. I believe we can see these magical threads in some of the art. You can also see them all around the Yuntal. I believe that what's supposed to be happening here is that the Axiomata are these magical threads, and they are all over the place in the world, but you can bend them with magic, and that's how you affect the laws, therefore casting an elemental spell. But the story made this all open to our imagination, because we are not mages after all. Why should we know? But besides the axiom, there is the other part about Ixtal, where Ixtal decided to isolate itself from the void. But we are not actually sure when that happened, because even after Icathia was lost, Nezuk was trying to deal with all the voidy mess, and he was a Ascended Warrior from Ixtal, so it probably had to be after Nezuk. So when the story mentioned that Ixtal got isolated the years following the final war, maybe it was a couple of years after the fall of Icathia, since that's when Nezuk stepped in. Maybe after he failed, Ixtal was just done. But you can learn about that in Malphite's story. Speaking of which, when you realize that Malphite is an Ixtali construct that's been warning people about the void sleeping beneath Ixtal, and that he was foreshadowing this story all along, I am in awe at what Malphite has become, after so many years of being a meme. Hey, did you know that we have social media and Twitch where we talk about other League facts and stories? And did you know that we have neat mugs and shirts too? The links to all of that will be below. And as always, thank you, come again.